Good afternoon, and welcome to the fifth Mondays at Beinecke online gallery talk of the semester. Today and every day, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. Today and every day, we honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Today and every day, let us also hear and heed the voices and stories of generations past and present who have fought against anti-Black racism, state violence, and systems of oppression, and who have fought for liberation, joy, and freedom. Today and every day, let us strive to see and know and recover the story of those whose lives have been hidden by intent or by neglect. My name is Michael Morand, and I am privileged to be the communications director here at the Beinecke Library. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. In 2013's magisterial African-American Connecticut Explored, Catherine Harris writes, "The African-American experience in Connecticut has received cursory attention in surveys of American history, unpublished microhistories, and published journal essays. When it comes to New Haven in the pre-revolutionary era, the amount of published material on the lives and contributions of African Americans is especially thin. I am fairly familiar with books and essays on the history of New Haven, and there is at best passing note of people of the African diaspora before the late 18th century. Even Robert Warner's essential 1940 work, New Haven Negroes, has only cursory information on the first 150 years of New Haven. The growing literature of African-American colonial life in New England also has little so far about New Haven, though there are vital stories about the Connecticut colony overall and some of its other towns. What we have instead are traces and notes and signs in primary source material, much of it waiting to be rediscovered, analyzed, contextualized, and renewed for contemporary audiences. I hope to make some small contribution to the essential work of rediscovery, remembrance, and repair this afternoon, inspired by a map and its marks. My talk today reprises and expands on a talk I first gave on April 24th, 2017. It draws on research done on site in the Beinecke Library and in manuscripts and archives, both of the Yale University Library and in the Whitney Library of the New Haven Museum, as well as online with various sources preserved by archivists. And since yesterday was Valentine's Day, I offer this talk as a love letter to working in and working across libraries, and a love letter to library workers on our campus and in our community of New Haven. This is the map in the collections of the Beinecke Library. You can see and zoom in the high resolution version online and the Beinecke Library digital collections. Some background and context on this cartographic treasure. Catalog record reads, quote, "Manuscript map in blue and red ink depicting the original 9 squares. This map is possibly the original drawing by James Wadsworth, drawn from actual surveys. I've yet to determine its complete provenance, though we do know it has been in the Yale collections at least since the days of Alex Vitor, curator of maps at Yale from 1943 to 1978, who used it in classes. Vitor's notes on the New Haven 1748 map say, and I'm quoting, quote, "This is from an anonymous manuscript map now in the BRBL. It has been suggested that the cartographer was James Wadsworth, a senior at Yale when the map was drawn. The map remained in manuscript until 1806, when it was engraved on copper and printed. It has been one of the most popular maps of New Haven, reprinted many times. We have the 1806 printed map in the collections as well. Here it is, also available, and you can blow it up on your screen on the digital collections at any time. It was the first engraving done by Thomas Kensett when he moved to New Haven in 1806, after he moved here from England, where he had been an engraver at Hampton Court. The Kensett map says that it is a plan, quote, taken by the Honorable General Wadsworth of Durham, which would be the aforementioned James Wadsworth. Wadsworth graduated from Yale in 1748. He would go on to be a major general in the Connecticut militia in the Revolutionary War, a delegate to the Continental Congress, presiding judge of New Haven County, and a prominent lifelong citizen of Durham, Connecticut. The link between the manuscript and the engraving is William Lyon, who is credited on the Kensett engraving. It says, quote, respectfully inscribed to the Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences by their most obedient William Lyon. Lyon was a colonel in the Connecticut militia, a very prominent man about New Haven and its environs, and someone who would have known Wadsworth. We have another manuscript map in the collections with a note signed by Lyons reading, quote, plan of the town of New Haven with the buildings in 1748, taken by permission from the original of the Honorable General Wadsworth. So there's every reason to believe that the manuscript map of 1748 is indeed by a younger Wadsworth. And that's certainly what Yale historian George Wilson Pearson believed, as he includes it as an illustration in his 1976 short history of Yale, with the credit noting that it is, quote, a map of New Haven made by James Wadsworth, BA 1748, in his senior year. If you look at the map, you know it was not a professional map. It has delightful pictograms, boats in the harbor, tombstones, trees, cannons, among others. It is the earliest surviving manuscript map of New Haven. There were earlier maps, but this is the earliest that survives. A note about Wadsworth, that as a judge, he would go on to rule in one of the first court cases in Connecticut, establishing an enslaved person's right to legal redress against a dishonest owner. And that is an interesting note to consider as we follow the threads on this map. This is the oldest map of New Haven. It does not exist in its original form. What we have and what you see is a copy of a copy found in 1880 of the original 9-square plan of John Brockett's 9 squares. There's also a map of New Haven that shows New Haven in 1724. It exists in a copy that we have in the Beinecke Library in the Ezra Stiles paper, a copy made by Ezra Stiles in 1784 of a map originally drawn by Mr. Brown in 1724. So again, the map of 1748 that survives is the oldest surviving map of New Haven. And it's interesting in and of itself in that way. But as I noted, it would be engraved and printed and become one of the most popular maps of 19th century of New Haven. Why would it matter so much? This 1812 Amos Doolittle map gives us a little reason to understand why the 1748 map would be printed and circulated. This map shows in 1812, New Haven was modernizing, it was organized. And after 1748, that manuscript map of Wadsworth, many important things happened. Connecticut Hall was built, the Episcopal Church was founded. There were, of course, major national and international events, including, of course, the American Revolution and Independence. New Haven itself would be incorporated in 1784. The streets were named, the Grove Street Cemetery was built, industrialization was on the horizon. So Wadsworth, the 1748 map, represents in some ways a moment of the last days of ancient settler New Haven. The founding church, the mother church of New Haven, was still ascendant, the first society. The second church had just been founded and was new. This was just before New Haven began to take off economically. And I'd like to quote from an essay by Maureen Brady in 2014. She writes, and I quote, "It was only around 1750 that New Haven really began to experience a boom in its economy. The amount of tonnage in New Haven's harbor increased 40-fold between 1748 and 1774. As New Haven's mercantile prosperity increased, the town also faced a huge influx of population. It grew from more than 1,400 inhabitants to more than 5,000. Longtime residents and established families began to distinguish themselves as, quote, town-born, as opposed to the, quote, interlopers." On the Kensett engraving, you see this legend on the right of the founding families of the New Haven colony. It is in some ways an assertion of primacy of the ancien regime, of the standing order. And in fact, William Lyon, who had it engraved and printed and circulated, was married into the Mansfield family, among the first families of settler New Haven. And so he had these names placed prominently on the map. But in fact, they're not the only names on the map. And I would argue they are not the only names that matter, though they may, in fact, be the names that history has most remembered over the centuries to date. I want us to remember and know one of the other names. Inspired by the Wadsworth map, I want to do the essential work we might describe using the powerful phrase of Njabulu and Ndebele, the rediscovery of the ordinary. Let us account for the historiography of silence, the historiography of absence, and let us think about what stories have been published and promoted and what has not been celebrated and why. Let us rediscover and let us repair the record. All the names, close your eyes and imagine New Haven in 1748. The streets were not named as we know them. Not a single building that you see on the Wadsworth map survives. Hopkins Grammar School was a small building on the green. The harbor was much closer to where people lived. There wasn't the infill that would happen over the centuries. Most of the houses were quite plain. A few were painted blue or red, the fancy houses. Transport was all on foot or on horse. And Yale College was just one building plus its president's house. But look closer at the map. All of the names of the houses have first name, surname, John Smith, let's say, or widow surname, widow Smith, or title surname, except for one, a name that's on the block now bounded by Elm Street, College Street, Grove Street, and York Street. At the corner of where the Sterling Law Building sits and where the power plant and Grove Street Cemetery, at that intersection. The arrow points at that name. You can faintly make it out, and if you magnify it later, you'll be able to see it more on the digital collections. It reads, Jethro, a black man, farmer. It must be significant significant like all the other names, and it shows up in later maps, including the Lyon map, the Kensett map that Lyon had made. And here's the Doolittle map. You see that that area is actually called Jethro's Corner in 1812. So decades after the first map, it's called Jethro's Corner. And in fact, you can find in the written bylaws of the city of New Haven various laws that reference Jethro's Corner that were enacted on June 1st, 1803, and in June 8th, 1813. These laws were published as late as 1840, nearly a century after the first map. You still see notes of, quote, Jethro's Corner. It had not been in that 1724 map, and it was not on later maps such as the Buckingham map of 1830. So Jethro, a black man farmer, was present in 1748, and his memory persisted for perhaps a century. I'm keen for us to begin to rediscover who is this Jethro, a black man farmer. Quick demographic context in Connecticut and in New Haven at the time. The African American population of Connecticut was maybe 2 or 3% of the total population, and the same was pretty much true in New Haven County. In a census taken that's in the Ezra Stiles papers in 1762, you see that there were about 1,500 European Americans, of which 200 were scholars in Yale College. At the time, there were 83 African Americans in New Haven. This is in the compact, the immediate, what we would know as downtown New Haven, about 5.5% of the total. And there were 44 total households in this compact part of New Haven with African American residents, free or enslaved. And again, thinking about New Haven and thinking about the county and the town, you see that the population around 1774, at the time of the American Revolution, the black population in New Haven town and in broader New Haven County was about 3%. We need to remember that slavery existed in Connecticut and New England, and that slavery was slavery in Connecticut and in New England, as well as many other laws in a regime of oppression and policing of black people. Enslavement existed in New Haven at least as early as 1644, perhaps its settlement in 1638, but certainly by 1644. In Connecticut in 1690, there was a law against black people being out in the streets after 9 p.m. 1703, a law against selling liquor to black people. In 1708, a law that punished black people with whipping if they disturbed the peace or threatened to strike a white person. New London banned property ownership by black people in 1717. They petitioned unsuccessfully the colony to do the same. In 1730, the colony had a law of punishment for publishing anything that would be actionable if said by a free white person and against black people entertaining at home after 9 p.m. In 1774, the number of enslaved people in Connecticut was at 6,464, and Connecticut at that point, just on the eve of the American Revolution, actually had the most slavery in all of New England. The Connecticut Constitution of 1818 formally disenfranchised blacks from voting, though voting had not been allowed by matter of custom beforehand. And Connecticut was the last state in New England to completely abolish slavery in 1848. And of course, enfranchisement for black men would only come with the 15th Amendment in 1870. It's important for us to remember that we are not even through the second half of freedom. From settlement to enfranchisement was 232 years. and from enfranchisement to now is 151 years. So it's in this broader context, socio-political and demographic, of looking for Jethro, a black man farmer. There are a number of places one can go to begin to find the traces, to rediscover, and to begin to remember the story. Early church records are one of the best places, and that's where I began. These are the printed records from manuscript of the First Church of Christ, the founding church of New Haven, what we now know as Center Church on the Green. And you can see that he was admitted to the church in 1728. He was the 878th member ever admitted, according to the records. Others were Ginny and Mingo and Sanders before him. Jethro Luke, as we see here, his surname is listed, is the first listed with a surname. There were a total of 7 people of African descent in the first 1,000 members of the church. Jethro was followed by Ruth and Sabina and Sybil, and 5 more during his lifetime, because as we see on the record here, it also notes that he died 1760 to 61. This record gives us important information. It gives us a last name. It gives us the date of death. And so we can surmise that he was at least 18 years old, that he was born in 1710 or earlier. And we know the last name. So we can go with those to find other records. We also know from the church records that he was married to Mindwell Luke, and we were able to find out things about his children. The church records indicate a member named Rose Luke becoming a member on February 18th, 1753. She was married to Gad, who was Jethro's son. Using the name and other things, looking through more records, I went to the tax records and the land records. And again, remember, this is a time for Black people that would continue well into the 19th century of taxation without representation. And here in the manuscript tax records of New Haven, we see Jethro. This is a typescript of the 1745 Grand List. You see Jethro, and on the right, you see his property, worth 18 pounds, and the 1800 is pounds, shillings, pence. So we begin to know a little bit more about Jethro Luke, a black man farmer, that he was a property owner. There are no earlier identified non-white property owners in New Haven that I know of, so we can surmise as best we know that Jethro Luke was the first Black property owner in New Haven. I went inspired and led by Francis Skelton, wonderful librarian at the Whitney Library at the New Haven Museum, to the probate records. Francis helped me find things in the probate records, some of which are on microfilm, and many of which are now digitized and available through Ancestry.com. Probate records, of course, tell us if someone's there, what they owned, what they owed, and what they left and to whom. There are paper records in the State Library and microfilm in the New Haven Museum. What you see here are some of the pages of the records of Jethro Luke, his will and the probate when he died in 1761. So we find out much more about Jethro Luke. He owned the house and lot that you see on the map. He also owned a house and 15 rods of land north of the highway, so outside of the organized 9 squares. And he owned 7 acres of land in Plainfield, what we now know as Hamden. His assets included a number of belongings. He was clearly not a rich man, but he had a number of things, and you can see the total estate was sold at 67 pounds. The probate records note that Mindwell Luke, his widow, that the third part of the real estate that she received was worth 14 pounds, and that she got the house and the land that we saw on the map. As I mentioned, the church records note that she would remarry after her first husband, Jethro Luke, died. She married Isborn in the first church. And you see here a note that it's recorded as Mindwell Lake, L-A-K-E, a reminder that sometimes in the records and the transposition of handwritten to typescript records, there are misspellings. The probate records for Jethro Luke in 1761 and into early 1762, as the estate was disposed of, include the inventory, the creditors, and then the disposition. These are the creditors. It's a long list and an area that I would certainly like to know more, to learn more, and to hear from people who know more about such things. But one name stands out. It is this name, Mr. Clapp. The biggest creditor owed more than 22 pounds by Jethro Luke. Clapp is a name that I know, having studied him some when I was a student in the Yale Divinity School. Thomas Clapp was, in fact, the first president of Yale. Prior to him, the leaders of Yale were called rectors. He came as rector in 1740, served as president until 1766. In fact, the second longest CEO of Yale in its more than 3 centuries, an incredibly powerful figure who wrote the 1745 charter that still governs the university, and who organized Connecticut Hall along with the first library and wrote the catalog of the first library. There are no known portraits of Clapp. Connecticut Hall was, in fact, his magnum opus. It was only the second building purpose-built at Yale. It was the first brick building in all of Connecticut, funded by a lottery, by proceeds of a pirate ship, by subscriptions, by students. It was begun in 1748 and finished in 1752. Clapp, the president of Yale, was not only the president, he was the accountant and the construction supervisor. In 2001, Connecticut Hall was at the center of Yale tercentennial celebrations, and in fact, there was special postal commemoration that you see noted here with an article that says that Connecticut Hall was built by Francis Letort and Thomas Bills. We'll come back to that. It was built so that all students could live on campus, and it is in fact the oldest surviving building of compact New Haven. As I said, the name Clapp gave me more to work with because I know that there are records of his in manuscripts and archives in the university library. So back in 2017, I went to look at them and I've been back since. These are in his Sundry accounts where it notes that Jethro was involved with limes, i.e. with making of mortar for the new college. It was the first brick building, and so mortar was essential. Oysters were crushed and mixed to make lime mortar. And it also notes that Jethro's son Gad was involved as a worker on Connecticut Hall. There's more here that you see Gad's name many times, more about Gad doing work on the college. as well as Gad doing other work for President Clapp. This is a more formal accounting of the cost of the new college in the Clapp papers. And it's important to emphasize that this Connecticut Hall is something that was important in New Haven and for the colony and for the college. And that at this point in the 18th century, Yale history is New Haven history, is Connecticut history, is New Haven history, is Yale history. In Clapp's accounts, you see that Jethro and Gad's name are there doing work, as well as these names. Archibald McNeil, quote, his Negro. President's Negro. Mr. Noyes's Negro. Theophilus Munson's Negro. Mr. Bontecu's Negro. These are not hidden records. This is the formal treasurer's records that are signed by Clapp, by Joseph Noyes, the pastor of the First Church, and by all of the trustees, that note that the labor that built this included free people and included enslaved people. So we can tell from these records that Connecticut Hall is much more than, quote, a brick structure built by Francis Letort and Thomas Bills. Letort, according to the records, worked 165 days. Bills worked 114 3/4 days. The Luke family is recorded as working 191.5 days. Enslaved men worked 436.5 days. This was a time when the Black population of New Haven was 3%, but at least 27% of the labor, according to the records that I've seen, of the labor that built Connecticut Hall was Black labor, free or enslaved. So the history is not correct if it says that it was built by Francis Letort and Thomas Bills. Stop. It was built by many people. It was built by the Lukes. It was built by enslaved people. I have seen no notice of this anywhere except in Colin Kaplan's 2013 book, Legendary Locals of New Haven, in a note about Thomas Bills, which says that Bills built Connecticut Hall along with 25 other people, including enslaved and free African Americans. The map gave a name. The name led to church records, to tax records, to probate records. The probate records gave more names and led to manuscripts and archives and to the Clapp papers. All says that we must do more to rediscover, remember, and repair. I would close with a quote from a more contemporary account about Yale, a book published in 1929 about the Memorial Quadrangle, what we now know as Branford and Saybrook colleges. This book was written in 1929 by Robert Dudley French. It includes details of the architect, James Gamble Rogers, of the donor, and of every person commemorated in entryways, doorways, courtyards. It also says, and I quote, about workers who were killed in building the Memorial Quadrangle. Memory would linger also over certain men who lost their lives in the building of the Quadrangle. French writes, they went casually to their death in the doing of their day's work, like thousands of others in our busy, careless land. And the world took small notice of their passing. Still, They should be remembered here since they have set the red seal of their life gladly for the cause when the drums are beating and the flags are flying. An honorable thing, too, to walk daily in the shadow of the risk of death, that the world's work may be done. This is the sentence that I left out in the ellipsis. I emphasize it. In this history, Robert Dudley French wrote, quote, "They were just common laborers, and their names are of no consequence." It is up to us to confront the historiography of absence. The historiography of absence of people like Jethro Luke and his family, to do more research in the land records and the probate records, to consider bringing back Jethro's corner, but let us, if we do, give him his full name, Jethro Luke. At another time, I also want to muse about what's in a name, because you might have been wondering, Jethro. It's not a name you see commonly in the 17th or 18th centuries. And of course, Jethro was the father-in-law of Moses, the liberator of his people. I do not think it is an accident that Jethro had as a name Jethro. So there's more to do in the historiography of absence that has erased till recent times Jethro Luke and his family. And more broadly, there's work to be done to confront the historiography of absence in New Haven and Connecticut as in the nation. I would argue that we should do more to focus on 18th century and colonial New Haven and Connecticut. I think it's essential that we do more to recognize the importance and impact of the clap years. And we must do more research on laborers, free, indentured, and enslaved in colonial New Haven, in Connecticut, in Yale's first century. As we do, we need to remember that after a long historiography of absence, certain things remain true as they were. The largest early gifts for this institution, like so many, came from a global trade, came from a trade on rum, came from gifts of plantations, came from gifts of slave owners. The early labor included free people of color and enslaved people. And as Dr. Kendi shows so well, and as his book title says, Yale and New Haven and Connecticut, like America, are stamped from the beginning. Finally, and to return, let us remember, let us rediscover. They have names: Jethro Luke, Mindwell Luke, Gad Luke. Their names are of consequence. They have names, even if their surnames are not known to us or in the records. Mingo and Cuff and Sanders and Isborn and Belfast and Ginny and Sabina and Betty and Samson. Their names are of consequence. And they have names, even if their names are not recorded. They are not only, quote, his Negro and President's Negro, and Mr. Noyes' Negro, and Theophilus Munson's Negro, and Mr. Bontego's Negro. Their names are of consequence. Find their names. Know their names. Say their names. And let us honor their lives.